seen that the impacts are greater in economies which seem to have severe limitations to participate in the global economy, in world trade, and have their economies concentrated only in one or two sectors. The risk model, threw out a lot of different vulnerability drivers, identified drivers which were explaining the variations in risk. The two probably most powerful ones which came out across the different hazard types were poverty, measured by GDP per capita, and weak governance taken from elements from the World Bank's governance index. And this tended to indicate, again, that probably some of the countries we should really be concerned about are actually the very rapidly growing, rapidly urbanizing, lower middle income countries, where, coming back to 2 slides previously, exposure is growing very, very quickly, but the sort of elements of governance one needs to actually reduce the risk, better land use planning, better building codes, better enforcement, etc., are not coming on stream fast enough to compensate for that increase in exposure. We also then took the opportunity in around 12 countries, just from 2 regions, actually from South and Southwest Asia and from Latin America, to drill down and see what was happening inside these global risk patterns in a number of countries. And what came out of this analysis, which Julio will be going into in more detail, is clearly that most mortality and direct economic loss, as one would expect, seems to be concentrated in very infrequent but very extreme events. On the right hand of these 2 maps, we're looking at Sri Lanka. You can see this, which we've characterized as intensive risk, mainly associated with the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami in Sri Lanka. But if you look at other risk attributes, so forget mortality, forget the big economic loss, but look at just damage to housing, to local infrastructure, to schools, to roads, to health facilities, and to agriculture, then the damage is actually spread over a much larger risk universe made up of literally thousands and thousands of frequently occurring smaller scale events. And in the case of Sri Lanka, we found municipalities which were reporting, more than 100 disaster loss reports over the last 30 years, and this was common to the 12 countries we looked at. Filtering the intensive events, this is the longer term period extreme events from the database, what was left seemed to be increasing rapidly, particularly events associated, if you like, with wet events, floods, flash floods, heavy rains, and so on and so forth. And there's a number of, possible reasons why this is happening, which we looked at. One is clearly improved disaster reporting. The fact that in this graph and many other graphs produced from other data sources, I think, show an inflection from the early 90s onwards, does tend to indicate that there's something happening since the internet came on stream of simply more and more disaster loss and disaster events being reported. But we don't yet know, I think, really how to quantify by how much. The report also looked at how disaster loss feeds back into poverty. This is just a map of houses damaged in Mexico since 1980. The report featured a lot of econometric studies, again, mainly from Latin America and Asia, but also a lot of studies this time from Africa as well, which again I think helped again to deconstruct our idea of what disaster is. Disaster isn't just major mortality, it's not just major economic loss. It's also impacts on poverty, on human development indicators, on nutrition, on school enrollment, and many other factors. And I think across the econometric studies we found that anywhere where there was disaster loss, one could actually find negative impacts in these other attributes, and impacts which sometimes went 10 or 20 years into the future. The drivers the report identified were 3, the drivers of risk. One is deficient urban and local governance. These 5 maps are from an excellent citywide disaster database in Cali, Colombia, from the 50s through to the end of the 90s. And are mapping flood events right down to the neighborhood level. And if you actually look closely at the maps, that is if from the back you can see the maps, you will see the flood events apparently expanding outwards in a fairly concentric fashion from the 50s through till the year 2000. What you're actually more or less modeling there is the expansion of urban informal settlements in the city, mainly in low-lying areas and mainly without drainage infrastructure. We don't need a kind of a PhD in flood studies to understand why squatter settlements in low-lying areas without drainage infrastructure get flooded every time it rains. But currently we have, according to UN statistics, more than 1 billion people in the world living in urban informal settlements, a number increasing by more than 25 million a year. So this is clearly, I think, one important area, one important driver which is helping to explain that risk trend we saw a couple of slides back, even taking into account the probability of improved disaster reporting. Another one is clearly vulnerable rural livelihoods, not just in sub-Saharan Africa, though in sub-Saharan Africa there is a particular concentration of rural poverty, of people living under the poverty line with exposure to a range of hazards, including drought, flood and cyclone. But principally here we're talking, I think, about, lack of resilience, the incapacity of many rural households to really be able to bounce back, even after, relatively small losses. And the third driver we looked at was declining ecosystem services, mainly using data from the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. Clearly the destruction of mangroves, of forests, of wetlands has an impact on hazard patterns, which again is probably contributing to the increase in risk we saw. These 2 maps are looking at landslide risk in Peru before and since the mid-1980s. And on the right-hand map, you'll see in the center a focus area of reported landslide disaster events which weren't there before the mid-1980s. This is an area where a road was built through from the capital into the central jungle, opening the area for deforestation, agricultural colonization in a quite ecologically sensitive area, and the result is many new landslides. Everyone always asks us how the report addressed climate change, or did it address climate change? Well, we didn't do any forward predictions, and I'm happy to say we didn't. But we did try and see, to what extent climate change would act on what we'd identified as happening in the past. For example, work we did with WMO highlighted, an increase in the number of strong Category 4 and Category 5 cyclones, particularly in years with hot sea surface temperatures. But I think what the report says is that, well, we can't actually blame climate change for urban informal settlements in flood-prone areas. We can't really blame it for vulnerable rural livelihoods, and we can't blame it for the destruction of sensitive ecosystems. However, if these are the things that are driving the risk, those things will be magnified by climate change. And if we look at the very uneven distribution of risk we talked about in the first couple of slides, then clearly there's an enormous potential for that unevenness also to be magnified by climate change as well. And there's examples in the report of a few calculations and examples we did on that. I'm going to stop here, and then I'm going to ask our next presenter, Uwe Dijkman, to come forward and talk to us about the global risk analysis. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Andrew. I'm Uwe Deichmann. I'm here at the World Bank in the Development Research Group, and I was collaborating with this large team led by Andrew on the Global Assessment Report in 2009. And my job was mostly to work on what is Chapter 2 in the report, the Global Risk Update. And I was focusing mostly on the economic analysis. I'm going to talk also about the hazard data development and so on, but that was really done by a team in Geneva led by Pascal Peduzzi with lots and lots of collaborators from USGS, from universities, from Norwegian Geotechnical Institute and so on. So I think I can answer most questions about the hazard issues, but if not, I'll just give you Pascal's email address. You can contact him. So what we did for Chapter 2, for what we call the Global Risk Update, is really sort of a massive data development and analysis effort to answer what is really three very simple questions at the global level. So which countries are most exposed to hazards? What countries suffer the most losses, not just adding up the losses in MDAT, but coming up with sort of more of a systematic risk model to answer these questions. And then to get some idea of what drives those losses. And Andrew has already given you a preview, so some of this may be a little bit repetitive. So this global risk update for the GAR was really an update of two reports that came out about 5 years ago. One was headed by the World Bank together with Columbia University, other collaborators, which was the Natural Disaster Hotspot Study that I think in the bank at least helped us a lot to get disaster risk issues, risk management issues on the table in more of the operational fields among the sort of operational staff that's doing projects that does not really normally think so much about natural disaster risk. And the other was the UNDP-led Reducing Disaster Risk study that Pascal Peduzzi had been involved in. And so what we did in this round basically was to merge the two teams, which we probably would have done 5 years ago if we had known of each other when we started, to make a lot of progress in terms of both data development, but also probably more importantly on the analytical approach in developing indicators for disaster risk. So we have a lot more complete, especially, and more detailed data on both hazards and exposure. We're still doing fairly poorly at the global level on vulnerability, and I'll talk about that a little bit. But I think the main analytical progress we've made, apart from all the data progress, is really to go from a very aggregate analysis of the information to create country-level indicators and so on, to go to the individual event level. So one major progress the team in Geneva made was to essentially geo-reference all the individual records in the MDAT database that probably everybody is familiar with here. And so we could link the actual information on losses, both on mortality and injuries and so on, as well as the economic losses to individual hazard events where we knew the characteristics of the events, where they occurred, when they occurred, and so on, which of course opens up all sorts of opportunities for analysis. So Andrew already showed some maps for Africa. I think this is basically what the new database looks like in sort of more aggregate form. For the hydrometeorological hazards, in this case for Asia, we looked mostly at tropical cyclones and as well as at floods. We also looked at drought, but drought is really, as you're well familiar with, a completely different animal. So while there's a section in the report that describes drought patterns and so on, we did not make any effort to do any formal modeling as we did for the other types of hazard types. For the tectonic hazards, similarly, we mostly focus on earthquakes as well as landslides. There's also an analysis of tsunami risk that was done, but again, we did not attempt in this case to do formal modeling on tsunamis. So we're really focusing on the cyclones, floods, earthquakes, and landslides, which capture a very large share of the global losses from natural disasters. So to answer the first questions in terms of exposure, what countries or what regions are most exposed to natural disasters, we really need sort of two pieces of information. We have to have very good information about where disaster events or hazard events, should be more consistent with terminology, occur globally and as spatially detailed as possible. So in the example of tropical cyclones, for instance, we had a lot of information about the tracks of the individual cyclones over the last 30 years or so, and we were able to, in this round, fill a couple of important gaps, such as in the the cyclones hitting Bangladesh and so on, which we did not have much information about before. The team in Geneva then modeled this information to come up basically with footprints of each individual cyclone event, where it occurred and where it made landfall and what regions were affected. And then the second piece of information we need is actually the exposed, what we call the exposed elements. So in this case, at a global level, we have to be fairly aggregate. So mostly we looked at population, the underlying population in the area where the disaster event or the hazard event occurred. But we also looked at, to get an idea of economic losses, at economic assets. And again, we don't have information about the actual assets, the physical infrastructure and the value of that infrastructure or productive infrastructure such as firms and factories and so on. So we are proxying that by a subnational GDP data set that we developed here at the World Bank. So, and then it's pretty straightforward using standard GIS operations to come up with information on the aggregate exposure within each area of a hazard event, and that can then be aggregated over time and over space to get country-level indicators. And this is one example for cyclones of the economic exposure at the country level. We have similar charts for mortality, for instance, and Andrew had already showed this. So on the left side, you see absolute exposure of GDP. On the right side, it's relative GDP, and you get a very different pattern. So on the absolute exposure, Japan is by far the most exposed country, but on the relative exposure, it's usually smaller island states that are most ranking highest. Now, to answer the second question on which countries are most at risk, risk and exposure, as we well know, is not always completely correlated. We essentially followed what is the standard hazard risk model, so where risk is a function of the characteristics of the hazard or of individual hazard event, of exposure and of vulnerability. And now, as I mentioned before, the advantage we had in this round was that we had a very detailed database of individual hazard events where we both had the outcome of the hazard event, which is the losses in terms of mortality and economic damages, as well as the characteristics of the hazard event in terms of the hazard itself, the magnitude, the severity, the wind speed, and so on, and as well as of exposure and of vulnerability factors. And essentially, when you have this individual information, you can think of it as a big matrix. You can do all sorts of statistical analysis on it. So we essentially ran regression models to come up with basically the contribution of each of these indicators on the losses that resulted from the hazard event. And once you have estimated these equations, you can use it for simulations and for impact assessment and things like that, which is what we did. So what we then did was to run these regressions on the time period that we think has the most reliable data from 1975 to 2008. But then we imputed average annual losses essentially by looking at the frequency of events in a given place and modeling them as if they all occurred in 2008, I think we used as the baseline data, which then can give us essentially estimated average annual losses in terms of mortality as well as economic damages for each country. So that's an imputation approach which essentially mimics what is a standard risk assessment model that you would apply in a city or in a region, but extrapolated at the global level. And that, again, we can summarize either by subnational units or by, in this case, countries. And what you see on this chart is basically on the horizontal axis, the absolute fatalities per year, in this case, of a multi-hazard indicator, since our outcome measure, even though the hazards themselves all have different characteristics and different metrics in which we are measuring hazard severity and so on. Of course, the outcomes are uniform across the different hazards. You have mortality or you have economic damages. We can aggregate them up to come up with multi-hazard mortality indices, essentially, which we've done for individual hazards, and then basically aggregated to different multi-hazard indices. So on the horizontal axis, you see the modeled fatalities per year. And of course, the bigger countries, China, India, Bangladesh, and so on, show up on the right. And on the vertical axis, you see the relative fatalities, and you see that some smaller countries like Dominica and Vanuatu and Comoros and so on show up as the highest ranking in there. So it's very similar to the chart I showed before. Okay. Now, since we did all this modeling at a very geographically disaggregated level, all our information is georeferenced, apart from having national level indicators, we can of course also look at it at the subnational level, and the report has a lot of maps that show the distribution within countries on a global level as well. Now, the danger, of course, is that a global analysis might be used then for subnational or for very detailed local analysis, which of course there are many, many caveats in a global approach why you always need for national level risk assessment a lot of more detailed information. So let me give you two examples. I think one area where we made the most progress in terms of hazard modeling is flood frequency. If you've seen the natural disaster hotspot study, it was essentially, we had information about watersheds in which floods happened, which is very, very coarse. So we had not very geographically detailed information about flood frequency or for different return periods. So in a model that was developed together with USGS here in the United States, we developed a new algorithm that's far more detailed. It's run on a 90-meter digital elevation model and gives us a very good, very precise view of where flood risk occurs. So there's an example in Bangladesh and India, which is truly a hotspot in terms of flood risk, of flood frequency. But the problem is that you cannot really anticipate just from a global digital elevation model all the factors that might influence your flood risk at the local level. So this is an example, again, in India, where the dark blue areas are the areas that we've modeled as being subject to floods under a certain return period. But in 2008, for instance, there was an event where there was a major dam breach, and it essentially affected an area that we did not identify as a flood risk area. So that's information that is very local, that needs to be incorporated in local studies. The second example, as I said, we also significantly improved the information we have on tropical cyclones, and that essentially gives you a time series, an aggregate view of a time series of pretty much all the cyclone events that we have information on. And again, we can use that for risk modeling, and this is, for instance, in the Arabian Sea, sort of an aggregate indicator of the impact of tropical cyclones in this region. But then in 2007, there was an event that affected Oman, which really had not been affected by cyclones at all over the last 30 plus years, which I think killed 50 people and caused billions of dollars of damages. So that's the danger of using models based purely on historical events, where you essentially cannot get the sort of events that might happen outside of the space that you've been looking at. Now, to answer the third question I raised in the beginning, what factors might drive risk? Andrew had already shown a couple of slides on the different contribution of different factors to overall risk. So we were able to do sort of a economic, essentially, decomposition of risk for different factors. And what you see in practically all cases for all the different hazards is that what increased the most really is exposure. So in the case of flood risk, for instance, in the period of 1990 to 2007, and this is sort of imputed from the data. So it's not actual observation, but it's basically modeled from the models that I explained before. So GDP exposure increased by almost 100%, while the actual flood losses increased by only 33%. And the implication of that, of course, is that vulnerability must have decreased. So if you ask me sort of for an educated guess of what the future trends will be or what the current trends will be, Andrew told you earlier that we were very careful not to make predictions into the future too much. But let me make an educated guess, which reflects one of the slides that was shown earlier. I would say that probably with climate change, sort of the scientific consensus is that for hydrometeorological events, there's a good chance that there might be an increase in either the frequency or the severity of events. For vulnerability, I think as countries grow richer, at least the mortality risk will probably go down. The economic risk may go up, but the relative economic risk, what we've seen, tends to go down as well. So the damages as a share of GDP are actually going down, even as the absolute damages are going up. But what was really an eye-opener to me was that the exposure is increasing very dramatically, and I think that is sort of overriding a little bit all the other factors. It's just that more and more people and more economic assets as countries grow richer are in harm's way, and therefore there's a good chance that the overall risk is still going up, even though vulnerability is going down for various reasons. So this just as a quick overview. I'll be happy to answer specific questions on any of these factors. The last thing I just want to mention is that the team in Geneva has done a really good job on putting all these data sets together. They're all available on the website. If you're not familiar with it, it's really worth checking out. And I'll just leave the web address here for a minute. Thank you very much.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Julio Serge. Again, for those that didn't attend to the Ignite presentation, I also work for the Global Assessment Report team in Geneva at the UNISDR. Today, my presentation will look into this drill down that we made to try to see what is happening below the global threshold. It was a look at risk patterns at the local level, and a closer look to the nexus with poverty and development. Basically, what we not discovered, because we know about this for a long time, is that viewed at the local level, the perception of risks and disasters is very different than the view at the local level. This is, we believe, extremely critical to understand, the dynamics of risks and, their relation again with poverty and development. We based most of this development on a very large set of information collected in 12 countries, initially in Latin America, where we obtain very detailed data, subnational disaggregated data about disasters. This, as opposed to the global assessment, that was done, that was described by Uwe, which was based on the MDAT database. The MDAT database features, global level of observation events that are disaggregated at a country level. These databases contain disaggregated information within a country as observed by national actors. So they really provide a very interesting view of what is happening, at a local level. We ended with a database with about 126,000 records of reports of small, medium, and large-scale disasters on these 12 countries. The findings, of course, was, as I said, that below, this threshold of large-scale events, which are basically the ones that get most of the international attention, emergency funds, etc. I call them the CNN disasters, which is the Myanmars, the Haitis, the tsunamis, etc. Below these huge, smoke curtain of, very large disasters, there is, these disasters can be seen in these charts as peaks. They occur relatively infrequently. They have very, very large events. We call them, intensive risk events. Below this threshold, there is, a huge amount of small and medium disasters that are constantly hitting our communities. And they are producing extremely important effects and damages on this. The difference between these two graphs is simply putting a logarithmic scale. That allows, what we saw, hitting here in this chart as something to be, very, very minimal effects. Now here you can see what's happening. Yes, we don't have peaks of 20,000 people killed, as in the case of Colombia. But you can see that the average of mortality caused by these disasters is about, between 100 and 600 or 700 persons per year. That is, significant. As you will see later, when we look at other aspects and other types of damage, this becomes even more dramatic. So we initially tried to statistically divide, and formally use methods to divide these small and medium scale disasters and try to treat them as a separate category. So for these, we experimented several statistical methods and a heuristics approach to divide this set in these categories. And basically we arrived to a threshold of 50 people killed and 500 houses affected or destroyed, which allowed us to see that 83% of total mortality reported in these 125,000 reports was concentrated in less than 1% of these reports. So these are, intensive risk CNN disasters. And below this threshold, we have 99% of these reports that only account for 16% of the mortality. Now, we conducted a lot of analysis on these data sets over time, over space, on different aspects of the damages and mortality and asset loss, et cetera, and we found some very, very interesting issues. First, that this low intensity damage and asset loss is extensively spread, as opposed to the intensive risks that were found on the global assessment, the global update, which showed that intensive risk is very unevenly distributed. So the high risk is very, and if we drill down with the countries, we will find most likely the same pattern. But this low intensity damage is very, very well and uniformly spread over space. The second issue that we found, which was already mentioned by Andrew, is that weather-related extensive risk is increasing rapidly. This number of reports and damages is steadily growing all over the sample of countries that we reviewed. The third one is that we started to get a hint that, and have, empirical proof that these drivers of risk that, were already explained here, urbanization patterns, territorial occupation, environmental degradations, are definitely correlated to risk, and they are the underlying risk drivers. Last but not least, we were able to establish a strong correlation between both types of risks and the long-term and short-term poverty outcomes. So the first thing is that extensive risk, as you saw, is much more uniformly spread over time. Here you can see the entire database depicted over the last 30 years, and you can see that the yellow area, slightly emphasized here, is effectively continuous. And we also saw this one before, that this extensive risk is much more uniformly spread over space. This is another example of this case. This is Iran. And I want to show this case because in the same way that, in Sri Lanka here, we have most of the damage caused by a geological event. Here in Iran, 90% of the damage is also caused by geological events, which are the ones that are distributed less evenly. Return periods for geological events, as you all know, are much larger. But even though we are talking of these types of events, you can see that intensive and extensive risks are unevenly distributed, and intensive events are uniformly spread. This is a much more clear pattern in regards to wet disasters, as Andrew called them. We also saw that weather-related risk is increasing rapidly. These charts show number of loss reports. However, we also produce these charts for other variables, including, housing damage, agricultural damage, and all of them showed consistently the same pattern in both absolute terms and relative terms. The chart below the main one shows the number of houses destroyed in average per report. So it's not just that disasters, the number of disasters and their frequency is increasing, also the average effect of these small and medium disasters seems to be increasing. Again, we saw that if we keep drilling down and we go to urban spaces, to and to look at the environment itself, we will keep seeing the same patterns. That the risk is uniformly spread. If you add these 5 maps, you will see that disasters have happened all over the city. That there are no places not free of disasters. And the second, of course, that the pattern of disasters follow, the risk drivers. When we started using this national disaster database, we also started taking advantage of a very important fact. International databases basically focus on mortality and economic loss, which is understandable. These are, main concerns. However, progress in many of these countries is also measurable by the fact that we have many more usable indicators in this database, especially in the housing sector, agriculture, transportation, roads, etc., etc., etc. And that allowed us to give a better and more holistic view to risk. So one of the things that we found, taking advantage of these additional indicators is that when we get away from mortality and we start looking into livelihoods, lost assets, etc., etc., the role of the extensive risk, the contribution of extensive risk becomes more and more important. So in the left upper corner, we have mortality, completely dominated by intensive events. The lower left chart, houses destroyed, we see that now the contribution of extensive risk starts being a little bit higher. But if we see damage to houses, the contribution of the 2 types of disasters is more or less equal. It's comparable. And if we go to other types of assets, it's incredible that, that this situation is completely inverted. The contribution of intensive events is minimal, and the accumulated effect of the extensive risk to the total damage goes through the roof. So we, using these type of data, we conducted a large number of country case studies in which the relation between poverty and disaster was studied, as was presented in the first presentation. And of course, the evidence showed that disaster impacts have a direct and negative effect on welfare at the local and regional levels in terms of, direct economic, monetary poverty, loss of assets, reduction of income, etc., etc. And the same as we found at the global level between poor countries and rich countries, we have strong evidence that communities in poor areas lose a far higher proportion of their assets, as opposed to more wealthier communities in the same countries and in the same areas. This is a very important fact. We also were able to provide evidence that the impacts of these disasters, both intensive and extensive, lead to longer-term outcomes, especially, for example, in the case of children, mainly connected to food security, nutrition, etc., etc. It was very, very important to find this evidence because some of these things are very intuitive, but having statistical and evidence-based information to prove this has been very, very important. The last part of the poverty worked on the accumulated impact of disasters on poverty, which, when more frequent and successive disasters impact seriously the capacity to cope, which at some point is simply disrupted in these communities. So we understand that, and we have received feedback that the data has limitations and challenges. One was already mentioned by Andrew, is that we know that with the advent of the internet and electronic media and improvement on communications, we have much better reporting in the last few decades. We are working on that. We also understand that many of the findings of the report were done with a lack of very specific metrics, with especially the correlation between urbanization and ecosystem decline. We had a lot of qualitative indicator and qualitative evidence, but we are now looking for much stronger statistical proof for these facts. And as Andrew mentioned, there was no possibility to establish a strong correlation between climate change and disasters. As an example, we found that in some countries the number of floods were increasing, and also the precipitation had increased as a result of climate change. But we also found the opposite case, that in some countries precipitation was on decline, but still the number of floods was increasing. So it was very counterintuitive that that there is a relation between the two facts, despite the fact that we understand that climate change will eventually magnify the effects of all the underlying these drivers. So The last thing is that we only used 12 countries in Latin America and Asia. We are working very hard right now to expand this sample. We want to double this sample, and we have done a lot of progress, especially in Africa, where there's a tremendous lack of data for all of those who have worked in Africa. It's very hard to obtain good data, disaggregated, spatially reference, reliable data. So we are working on this so that we are working on refining this analysis. So with this, I think we close the three presentations. Thank you very much, and I'll
So I think it's, if I can see the clock at the back, it's around 10. So I would suggest we have approximately 15 minutes for Q&A. So feel free to ask any of the three of us questions. And we'll then ask Philippe from the European Space Agency at 10:15 to come on to do his presentation. So I have several questions which have already been written down. So if my colleagues will let me, I will field the questions to them, which gets me conveniently off the hook. So concerning the vulnerability information, and I think this is one for Uwe, how do you gather the country information and how is the information validated?
I don't know if that only refers to the vulnerability information. I mean, as I said, the problem on the global level is that we don't really have sort of very detailed subnational information on vulnerability. So what you would like to have is things like building quality for specific areas, ideally at the subsidy level, at a settlement level, and so on. And those kinds of very, very detailed, in terms of coping capacity, you would want detailed sort of poverty maps or maps of sort of capacity of local communities to switch to alternative income generation streams and so on if their assets are destroyed. And at the global level, we simply don't have this information. So we need to work with proxies, and this is sort of very common in macroeconomic studies. And there are a number of data sets that are available, and one that's, for instance, very useful for this kind of purpose is the governance indicators data set that is developed here at the World Bank by Kaufmann and others, which essentially tells you something about the strength of institutions in a country. So where we would like to know building quality or some information about what the quality of building codes in a specific place are, or how they actually enforced, we essentially have to use information that tells us something about the country's capacity or ability to build and also to enforce these kinds of institutions and regulations. So, I mean, there's this joke in economics that, I mean, what you would really like to do is do this at the micro level, where you're looking at an individual city or individual region, and then sort of do it more as a microeconomic study. But then again, you'd lose the generalizability of a global sort of helicopter view study. There's this joke in economics that says that if in microeconomics is essentially codified common sense, and macroeconomics is codified nonsense. And I wouldn't go quite that far, but there's definitely a bit of a generalization going on, which I think for a global analysis is quite justified, and I'm quite comfortable with the results we come up with. They sort of pass all the giggle tests. But as I said, with those caveats. And then in terms of validation, I mean, on the hazard side, certainly I can say that all the data development was extensively peer-reviewed in a process that was organized by WMO for the hydrometeorological hazards. So they had experts in the field who basically looked at the methodology and gave feedback, and we made corrections and so on. And then for the tectonic geological hazards, we had UNESCO was coordinating this. So there was a process of essentially going through a review by experts in the field, which was very useful. I think was much more systematic than in the previous efforts. That still leaves a whole huge range of uncertainty. I'm the first one to admit, certainly, if anybody has ever worked with the MDAT data, I think the team in Belgium is doing a fantastic job, and we should all support them, and they should get a lot of credit for what they're doing. But again, they will also be ready to admit that there's a huge amount of uncertainty, especially on the economic loss estimations. So what you find in the econometrics we did, the statistical models, that it's extremely difficult to get very robust results because of it's the idiosyncrasies of the events themselves, but also the reporting, I think, where we have to do a much better job in recording those damages. Sorry, that was not a short answer.
Okay, well, I think the second question is fielded to Uwe as well. I think the answers may be straightforward, but I think the explanation of why you're going to give the answer can be a longer one. Why is Dominica ranked so high in relative risk? Historical evidence does not support this conclusion.
Well, I'm not an expert on Dominica, but I mean this would be what the data suggests essentially, and there's a bit of a if you do the standard risk model, of course, you're sort of looking at the damages over, we used the period from 1975 to 2008, where we assumed that the records that we had available for the hazard events was relatively complete. And in this period, so basically it's sort of the aggregate losses over that period, and this may, there's not really a big division between lots of smaller events and one big event. So one big event would be weighted probably more in terms of hazard risk than you have the impression if you only look at the charts that Julio, for instance, showed us, and where you see the spikes of individual events. Then you may think it's a relatively rare occurrence in a given place, while in fact, this could have a large impact on the overall disaster risk. So if you have an average annual mortality of 1,000 people, that could be one event over 10 years that kills 1,000 people, or it could be 10 events that kill 100 people each. So that might be something that gives that impression. So I'm not an expert on Dominica. Maybe.
Hello. I probably would like to add to what you said is that the GAR methodology to assess risks also considers the relative damage. So that sometimes, and I know that not only for Dominica but for other countries we have received the same question. And this is because we are looking at the ratio, of damage, and population, which for the case of small countries can bump up the level of risk very quickly. So for the case of Dominica, we may have historically relatively low, levels of damage as compared to other countries. But if you, normalize these data with the population, then you will have that, the number, the average losses per capita or per household are very high. So that's why it's put on a higher scale.
Andrew, let's take that simple case. Dominica is a small island in the Caribbean. Dominica is a small island in the Caribbean. So is Grenada, Cayman Islands, and St. Martin. The big event in Dominica led to 100% of GDP losses. The big event in Grenada led to 180% of GDP losses. The big event in St. Martin led to 200% of GDP losses. The big event in Cayman led to 180% of GDP losses. So I've given you 4 islands in the same area, and Dominica was number 4 on the list. And all these information are publicly available. The big event in Montserrat led to 350% of GDP losses. So, why Dominica?
You're raising a very good point, and probably what you are pointing out is problems with data sources. And despite, as I know, I truly believe, as Uwe said, that the team No, the team in Belgium is making a fantastic job of trying to keep up with all disasters in the world. But if you go to MDAT and you look at disasters on Cayman Islands and other, you may not find those records on the database. So probably they never made to the study. So that could explain why, small islands, with, relatively non-advertised large events do not make up to the front.
I just also, given that it's Tony, I will also intervene at this point. I think the model we've used, which is, as Uwe explained, a statistical regression model, is good for identifying general patterns and trends between regions and between groups of countries. Where it really starts to fall down, and that's what Uwe was saying in terms of the dangers of getting down to the specificity, is actually being able to actually explain specific events. And I think that's a definite limitation of the model. And another limitation is clearly because we're talking about average annual losses, you may get a single event which, may be concentrating 100 years worth of average annual losses in a single year. So I think if you look at any one event or any set of single events, whether it's in Dominica or elsewhere, the model doesn't necessarily do a very, very good job of explaining that particular event. I think it does do a fairly good job of actually explaining the differences at the global level between different geographical spaces. We have, I think, another 13 questions, and we have around 5 minutes. So I guess we can be quite selective in terms of which questions we answer. Some of them are, I think, some fairly factual questions, which I will just ask Uwe to maybe very quickly mention. One is whether we're using purchasing power parity in terms of the GDP per capita calculations, and if we're using Landscan for the population data source, what is its vintage? I don't know if you want to address those.
Yeah, we used nominal GDP, but it's constant. So it's 2000 GDP, I think. So it's actually interesting when you see the loss figures that are always in the reinsurance reports and so on, that you always see this really nice trend going up and a fitted curve that goes straight up and so on. But once you actually express it as a share of GDP, which increases in all those countries, and you use constant GDP rather than not adjusting for inflation, it's actually pretty flat. So, but we could argue a long time whether PPP is the better measure. I think also for the World Development Report 09 that we used, where we did a lot of sort of economic geography analysis, we decided to go with nominal GDP, which is really sort of, especially in an international context, what matters for countries. But there are many other applications where PPP adjusted GDP is better. The other reason is actually that there's no good time series for PPP, because for this analysis it was really important that we had the GDP in the year in which the event occurred. And for PPP there's now just been a revision, but there's really not a good time series that is consistent across all countries for PPP adjusted GDP. And the second one was... we used actually not Landscan, but Alex is here from Season. Season at Columbia University collaborated with us on the population data sets, which is the GPW, the global population. And again, that's because it's better documented, essentially. Landscan is very, very detailed. It's a great data set and so on. But to me, it's still a little bit of a black box data set. I have no idea how they're redistributing population and what the sources of the input population are and so on. So I love it for cartographic purposes, but I'm a little hesitant to use it for analytical modeling, and I'm much more comfortable to work with the GPW where I know what's gone into it.
Yeah, perhaps one for Julio, which is actually how you were in your presentation defining disaster reports, because you're using a definition which differs from the MDAT definition of disaster report.
Yes. The definition of disaster report in this inventory is the set of damage and losses that occurred in a specific geographic unit because of a specific event. As opposed to the definition of MDET, which contains restrictions on, in terms of the number of people killed, for example, must have at least 10 people killed or 100 people affected, or the declaration of an emergency. Both definitions refer to one geographic unit. In the case of MDET, this geographic unit is the entire country. So for the case of the tsunami, they produced 7 records, 7 reports. For the same event, we produced maybe 450 reports to each of the small geographic units that were affected by the same event because of the resolution of each of the 2 databases. I don't know if that responds to the question.
Someone has asked, is there any correlation between the Human Development Index and mortality risk? Yes, we found a strong correlation, but actually the correlation was even better with GDP per capita. So, one could have used it more or less, I think, interchangeably with GDP per capita, but GDP capita was the, in a sense, the vulnerability proxy which best explained the variation rather than HDI. Someone's asked, Uwe, you mentioned preview. Is that an interactive viewer of the GAR-09 results? The answer is
yes.
Is it web-based?
Yeah, it's web-based, but there's also all the data are actually available. I think pretty much all the data. Otherwise, you would have to contact Pascal directly. But they really try to do a good job on disseminating all the information. So they, usually it's sort of processed at a high level. But it's really an incredible wealth of the data set. And I think that's one advantage of, coming more towards a process of global risk analysis rather than having these one-shot efforts that have been scattered through various institutions, is to just improve the database as we go along. So, the example I gave earlier is a great one on we had a real gap in the hotspots for the Indian Ocean cyclones that hit Bangladesh. And we had a colleague here, Henrike Brecht, who works for GFDR. Actually, she just moved to East Asia, who went to Bangladesh and sat for a couple hours drinking tea in the Met office there and was able to get information for cyclone tracks for that region for a whole number of years. And I think as we go along, many of these efforts will really result in a much more comprehensive data set, and the more we can make that available to everyone, the better. And then people can do their own analysis of small Caribbean countries and see why Dominica ranks so high. Just one more point on that. In the statistics, one factor that is consistently significant, I think both in the mortality and certainly in the relative economic loss models, is whether or not the country is a small island developing state. So that's really one factor that suggests that there's something about small islands that they are affected more than proportional given their small population and their small economies.
Okay, we still have some unanswered questions, but actually time is against us. It's marching forward. So I'm going to ask Philippe to come forward now from the European Space Agency and give us his presentation. Thank you.
Good afternoon, good morning. Julio, thank you very much for giving space to Lisa for this presentation. I'm Philippe Bali from the European Space Agency, and I represent the Space Agency at the Secretariat of the International Charter Space and Major Disasters. In that sense, I am a user of your analysis, and we use your reports. We use the GAR report, the Columbia University work, the World Bank analysis, the analysis of UNEP-GRID, the work of Pascal Peduzzi. All this is used by space agencies because we try to make acquisitions of satellite data, not in response to disasters, but in advance to anticipate disasters. So all this analysis that you describe is used in our work daily and routinely, and we plan acquisitions for the background regional missions of our satellites. Thanks again for giving space for this presentation. I'm going to explain to you the contribution of data and services from satellite missions in the domain of risk. There are many programs run by ESA in the space domain. One of them is Earth observation, and that's the context of this presentation. ESA has launched several satellites, ERS-1, ERS-2, and VSAT. Now, VSAT is the largest civilian satellite for Earth observation. It's big as a bus, provides many instruments and tons of data. And there are two main applications of this data. Firstly, scientific applications with a series of scientific results for the scientific communities in various domains, atmospheric, biosphere, etc. But also operational applications, and one of the examples is an operational and sustainable service operated in Europe to monitor European waters for oil pollution, and that's the opposite angle of the application cycle. This is not about scientific application, but routine measurements with operational data on the same principle as meteorological missions. One of the activities of ESA in the domain of risk is disaster response. ESA is associated with 10 space agencies in a collaboration that is the International Charter. We can have separate discussion after this presentation on, from some of you who would have questions on who can be a user and who can trigger the Charter for disaster response. Citizens, organizations, at national level, international level. I'm available for discussion on this subject. The Charter is a very, very simple system. It allows user organization to have access quickly to a large series of different satellite data in response to a disaster. It's specifically available in the immediate response phase, the CNN events. Recent events that concern the Charter include the oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, and this event is still ongoing, and the Charter is continuously providing satellite data from a very wide range of different sensors to help NOAA and the Coast Guards of the US. As this conference started, there was also another activation of the Charter in Guatemala, where the international humanitarian community is involved in requesting the service and accessing the data for damage mapping information. One thing that is key with disaster response is the timeliness of the service, and this is a very basic model of the timeliness of a satellite-based service for disaster response. There are four main components. The first one is the time for the user to formally make a request, and this is very important for space agencies. We like to have the user having time to think if the request they make is a valid request for a disaster response, because the Charter mandate is to provide access to satellite data for major events, not for routine hazard monitoring. So the user needs to have time to make his decision. In average, over the last 10 years, the mobilization time from the user is 3 days. Sometimes the request comes immediately when the event occurs, but sometimes the user waits a threshold to be passed to request service to the space agencies. The second component is the time for the satellite to make the acquisition. The third component is the time to produce the satellite image. And the last component that is very important is the time to analyze the data and provide thematic information to the decision makers from disaster centers. Typically, this relies on the agility of the satellites to be fast in reprogramming their plan of acquisitions in order to be effective. The trend is to go to half a day for civilian satellites. In the next few years, the tasking time, which is the time to reprogram the tasking of the satellites, will go down to a few hours. The processing and delivery time is the time between the acquisition and the production of the satellite image, and this is typically 20 to 30 minutes for most satellites today. We use in that data to monitor the effectiveness of our system and service, and we try to correlate the Charter events with the top 50 events in that database, which are the most critical events in terms of fatalities, for example. So the two things that we observe is that there are more and more Charter activations, and secondly, the vast majority of these activations correspond to real major events. The typology of hazards that we address with the Charter is primarily on flood. It's very important to note that we don't categorize the hazard type, but the hazard impact type, which is the manifestation of the hazards. A hurricane may provoke landslides, or may provoke mud flow, or flood, or windstorm damage type, And what is important to us is the typology of the hazard impact, so we get the best type of satellite information to provide crisis mapping or damage assessment. The number one type of hazard impact is floods, and my colleagues from the Charter Board often say that there are two types of disasters for the Charter, floods and other disasters. A few examples of information products derived from the satellite data. These are services that are provided in near real time. The first target users of this system are civil protection authorities, disaster management centers, the international humanitarian community, the UN aid workers in the field. This is primarily for the crisis mapping, damage assessment in the immediate response phase. Zonation of earthquake damage in the aftermath of the Haiti earthquake. New Orleans, on request from the French Civil Protection, who were sending relief teams to support the US teams in response to the hurricane. Flood mapping in Europe, with precise observation from the Formosat satellite. Then you have other risk information services that are not immediate response to the disaster in the crisis time, but post-event detailed assessment. And this is more related to risk assessment and risk reduction than just the CNN type of event in the crisis window time. For this, the satellite data are used, but much more analysis is required in order to combine the satellite-based information with other type of information and to estimate risk. Some information concern the hazard itself or the hazard impact, hazard mapping from satellite data, or vulnerability information, or exposure information. Yesterday there was a very interesting session with Daniel Ehrlich of GRC concerning the use of EO for exposure. One may consider the use of EO for vulnerability, a difficult subject but very interesting, and one may consider the use of EO for the mapping of the hazard. In the case of geohazard, a technique was invented in the US that is radar interferometry, and it's been really developed in Europe, and specific techniques such as permanent scatters were invented by the Polimi University in Milano, and there are service providers operating routinely on a commercial basis available in the world today with very precise services on millimetric deformation measurements, and that can be used for a range of applications. Landslide, subsidence, volcano, earthquake, and I will show you a few examples. These are basin-wide landslide inventory maps that are produced on the basis of satellite measurements and hydrogeological analysis by experts. So you have a combination of satellite-based specialists and thematic experts like geological surveys who take the satellite measurements and transform the satellite measurements into thematic information on risk. So this is really into the risk analysis domain. This is used routinely in Italy, and this is used in Switzerland at national level with operational users. This is another example of subsidence with subsidence measurements. The red dot on this image of the city of Rome is showing subsidence movement in the center of the city, and the blue area on the volcano on the bottom right is showing uplift that is linked to the volcanic activity and gas in the land. These products were given to the Civil Protection Authority in the city of Rome, and when we show the detailed subsidence phenomenon in the center of the city, the feedback we got from the Civil Protection was that the buildings that were shown with the map just collapsed the week before we had the meeting with them. So there was a good correlation between the risk analysis in the products and the records from the user that we met. Another application of the technique of precise terrain deformation is the flood defense and the stability of the dike monitoring systems. And there are specific techniques developed in the Netherlands to precisely monitor levees and dikes. And another application of interferometry is to analyze land deformation associated with a tectonic risk. And there are existing services today concerning historical deformation measurements, because the radar archives are very dense archive with 15 years of historical information, plus monitoring data. But looking at the future, there are new services that will be developed using this type of information for tectonic application with crustal block boundaries service and vulnerability map service for tectonics risk. And these are not services available, but services under development. This is in the framework of a European project called Terra Firma. And there are some expectations that this kind of thematic service will feed into the issues that the GEM activity is trying to address. But this is research, and the services are not yet available. This is investigations. Concerning the future, the strategy of Europe is based on the Global Monitoring for the Environment and Security, a project that is a European Union project where the European Space Agency collaborates with the European Commission. And the main logic of this project is public services for public users. In the logic of GMES, a large range of public users have been engaged to exploit and use satellite information services, and there are several hundreds of public users engaged with service level agreements, more than 50 in the case of geohazard risk, for example. And based on this, satellite missions have been defined for the future. And the Sentinel missions, Sentinel-1, 2, 3, 4, are satellite missions that are designed based on the requirements of these operational users. This is not for a scientific application. This is for operational monitoring of risk or other type of thematic applications. And this, in the case of risk and disaster response, will bring new operational missions that will be more like meteorological missions, operational, the washing machine concept, not the scientific mission with many parameters to adjust, so they will be able to provide routine information on an operational basis. Further to this, the plan is to provide a long-term access to satellite missions, because for the users, what is key is not just to have the information today or tomorrow, but to have long-term access to information, guaranteed access to information. And if one is basing services on a certain type of information, in 10 years this information should still be available, otherwise the service is not sustainable. As a final message on this presentation, a few observations made by ESA on the domain of risk. Firstly, on risk and disaster response, the International Charter is a growing mechanism. There are more users, civil protection authorities and UN users. There is increased performance and timeliness, and the rapid mapping services are being adopted by disaster centers. There are other capacities devoted to public users being put in place. For example, GMES in Europe, with an application of GMES concerning risk, specifically disaster response and emergency mapping. Examples of achievement include the fact that, for example, in Italy, the government of Italy has procured on a routine basis a high percentage of all acquisition of the Envisat satellites to ensure systematic coverage of geohazard risk with interferometric application all over the territory of Italy. Another example is the domain of geohazard, where more than 50 geological surveys from Europe are engaged with the GMES projects for terrain deformation services for geohazard risk. And my last slide is on the final message. There are many satellites that will be available in the future that will have the goal to address the constraints coming from the user requirements for environment and security applications. Long-term continuity of these sources is assured because the budgets are available, so there will be a very, very large volume of satellite data available routinely. In the context of ESA and Sentinel satellites, the data policy is that these data will be available for free, which doesn't mean that the service will be for free, because you need to analyze and interpret the data, but there will be large volume of data available everywhere in the world at no cost. Europeans have an innovative industry able to analyze and transform this data into information, including for risk assessment. Earth observation is moving from an R&D technology to a basis for provision of operational services, and Europe is in a leading position for that with the GMES projects. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Philippe. And thank you very much to all of you for attending this session. We hope it was useful for you, and I'm sure through correspondence or email we can continue to answer questions and engage with you, and hopefully get you to contribute to future editions of the Global Assessment Report. Thank you very much. And thank you, Uwe and Julio, as well. Thank you.